Hello, everyone. We are here today with Dr. Anjanette DeCarlo, who's currently the Chief Sustainability Scientist at the Aromatic Plant Research Center, where she conducts field research and ecological supply chain analysis on aromatic species. She also directs the Save Frankincense initiative. Dr. DeCarlo received her doctorate in natural resources and environment, from the University of Vermont, and has worked on post-conflict evaluations of natural assets and environmental projects all over the world. Previously, Dr. DeCarlo was the program director of the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics. She also worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council and UNSO office in New York City. Currently, she serves on the board of directors of Somaliland Biodiversity Foundation and National Parks Conservation Association. Recently, Dr. DeCarlo's work on frankincense was highlighted on CNN, Inside Africa, the New York Times, and National Geographic, as well as numerous other media outlets.
We're so happy to have you.
I'm going to just kick it off and ask you, why did you start Save Frankincense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started working in doing ecological evaluation of frankincense forests in the early part of the decade. And after working for so many years and being in the field, it was obvious that there was really a need for more education and awareness as to the plight of frankincense and what's happening with frankincense. Originally, we started it just focused on Somaliland and just a certain region of Somaliland. But after traveling to many of the different countries where frankincense grows, we realized that there were many commonalities, but also lessons that could be learned cross-country and across different species of frankincense to bring awareness to frankincense as a whole. So Save Frankincense just became the buzzword. We would talk in meetings often and say, how can we save frankincense, or what would we do to save these trees or save that? And I said, well, that's the initiative then, isn't it, to save frankincense?
So in addition to that, this is a sustainability group. So one of our primary questions was, can there be truly sustainable frankincense in terms of how it's harvested and used and everything?
Yeah. So this is a big question for us to unpack, right? So we can start unpacking what that is. If you'll indulge me for 1 second, I actually want to show you and show to all the viewers some frankincense resin. And
awesome. Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Is that okay? And get a little sense of what we're talking about, right? Because frankincense is a tree resin, and the trees that ooze these resins after they're wounded, they have to be tapped or wounded for these resins to come out. They produce these gorgeous tears. This is a tear of Fariana. There's several different species. There's many different species of frankincense, right? So what is frankincense varies. Now, here's Boswellia Fariana, and here's Boswellia occulta. I mean, they look completely different, right? They're two different species, but they're both frankincense. This actually is a species that our field team discovered. We got to name a new species of frankincense the year before last, and so that was really exciting as a science geek. When we talk about frankincense tears, they literally are. Can you see how that's a little tear?
Mm-hmm.
It just drips off the tree like this. This is Boswellia carteri. And I'm lucky, I have a nice big bag of it right here. Boswellia carteri. This is the species that has become extremely popular in the last 5 to 10 years. This is the one that there's more and more increased pressure on this, and so we'll talk more about that. This is Boswellia papyrifera. This is from Sudan, actually, this piece. It's one of my favorite pieces, just so pretty. I get that nice and close. You can really see all little tears. It's papyrifera. But even just in papyrifera, there's so much variation because we can also get these quite green tears. You see how green that is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's the same species. It's papyrifera. So there's a lot of variation, and I'll show you one more. like show and tell when you were kids. Right? I would have been the kid bringing frankincense. This is Boswellia dalzielii. Now that doesn't look like an amazing chunk, but I've got a whole big, that's the whole tier right there. That's the whole piece. And this comes from Burkina Faso. So we see now that frankincense grows in many different places. And then I have a couple pieces of Sakura from Oman. Looks very similar to the Carteri because in fact in botany they are considered the same species, but their chemistry is different. So in the essential oil world and in perfume world, they're referred to separately in many cases. And so, oh, and last but not least, just for fun, this is myrrh, which, you know, frankincense and myrrh are often talked about together. They do grow closely in the near each other in the same ecoregions. And as you know, the biblical story that frankincense and myrrh were both brought to baby Jesus because they're incredibly potent medicines, both of them. And so in aromatherapy, and they're the yin yang of each other. And so often we like to talk about frankincense and myrrh together, even though they're separate genus. So, okay, so that's my show and tell. And I really wanted to show you that because this is just a little taste of the variation and the difference that is frankincense. There is no one type of frankincense, and there also isn't, even with the same species as I showed you, it can vary in terms of the season, how the tree was tapped, you know, how the tree was cared for, can make differences. Even in the same tree, there can be chemistry variation from year to year. So all of that is to say that this is a wildcrafted species. And we want to be really clear about that. These are non-timber forest products, right? They're tapped from trees that are growing in forests. There's nowhere in the world where there's any extensive farming of frankincense in plantations. The only country that currently has plantations or large nurseries is Oman. And I have visited those, containing between 1,000 to 1,500 trees in certain areas where the government back in the 90s started to work more aggressively on saving their frankincense trees and also bringing them into cultivation. So for the most part, it's all wildcrafted. And that really is a big difference because when you ask the question, can it be sustainable? Can frankincense harvesting be sustainable? We really have to look at it under the umbrella of being wildcrafted and being a non-timber forest product. Now, trees are the most susceptible to decline from use because they take a long time to grow, right? And so when trees are overtapped or overharvested, that's very difficult for having a sustainable balance, right? Because they don't grow back as quickly. And we've seen this with other slow growing plants as well that are harvested. If they're slow growing, they're more at risk for overuse and overexploitation. So a lot of frankincense tapping is not sustainable. And, you know, if you've seen any of my work or seen the documentaries, you hear me talking about that a lot. And I've made a lot of friends and a lot of scientific breakthroughs being in the field and working closely at the trees. But I've also made some enemies by raising the red flag and saying, hey, we have a problem here. And the science really is showing that we are seeing some serious issues with the overtapping of frankincense trees in certain places. Absolutely not everywhere and not all trees. I mean, I can't make a blanket statement because I haven't covered the entire world of frankincense to say in every last place there's problems. But certainly in a majority of places that we've worked on the ground, which is quite extensive, we've seen serious issues with overtapping and overharvesting. The other part that I often use as having a background in the social sciences as well is interviewing people and talking with communities. So not only doing ecological assessment, running transect lines, counting trees, doing this kind of activities, but also sitting with communities and interviewing them and getting to know them and what the issues are for them around sustainability of the trees. and why that's possible for them or why it's not possible for them. And so a lot of what I've learned about frankincense is from talking to the communities and really being directly on the ground with them, understanding what's happening. And, you know, I'd love to stay in their communities for days at a time. Sometimes it's not safe, or they don't want that for me because they want me to be, they're very hospitable, especially in Somalia. They treat guests really well. They're very friendly when you're a traveler. And so they always wanted me to be spoiled. And I'm like, oh, I want to camp out here. You know, I just want to sleep here on the ground, guys. And they're like, no. When we've done that, they've always brought me these amazing beds that we've thrown outside in the forest. Pretty funny. But the question around sustainability is something that definitely everyone involved in frankincense is wrestling with. And so in certain locations, I have seen serious overtapping of the trees as well as serious poverty, right? And when you have those two forces coming together, where you have a precious commodity that's in high demand and you have extreme poverty, as well as lack of governance or inability to regulate how those trees are tapped, or to, you know, have some kind of codes around that everyone adheres to and or are enforced, it's very hard to have it be sustainable when it's in high demand, right? So the demand itself isn't necessarily the problem, but the set of circumstances with the high demand are problematic in terms of if you and I were extremely poor and we had access to these trees and we knew that we could make ends meet by tapping these trees to feed ourselves and our children, we ourselves would be overtapping, right? So I'm really careful about pointing blame to the communities, because they're stuck in a poverty trap. And what that is when you're so poor that you can't really think past today. You have to think about right now. You have to think about taking care of yourself right this minute and your family, because you're so poor you can't project out into the future. You can't say, oh, well, you know, we'll plant these for 10 years from now, and not if you're hungry right now, right here today. It also means that communities don't have a lot of extra resources to invest in themselves, right? So they're just sort of going through the day to day to make it through, which also creates a lot of psychological and emotional upheaval for people to be living in the poverty trap. And so there's always a lot of emotion in the communities and working in the frankincense industry. There's so much emotion in the communities. They want to protect their trees, a lot of them, and they're stuck. They're stuck in this situation. So it is possible to have sustainability. We just have to work towards it. And I know that you want to ask me some very direct questions, so stop me at any time. Jump right in.
I have one more in terms of impact and sustainability, just kind of as a category. And one of the things that we were learning about frankincense and the harvesting of it is that it actually causes a lot of human conflict. And that's something that very few people are aware of like that level of impact. So it's like, we might just use like, oh, frankincense essential oil, that smells so nice, I'll put it in my bath. When in fact, it's a life or death situation for a lot of people as a result of using that like product. So we were curious in terms of how you want to, I guess, describe or explain like that social impact from that heightened level.
Yeah.
It's not just poverty, right? Like there's actual conflict on the ground.
Not just poverty. Well, and you know, poverty is violence, right? Yeah. So living in poverty is a form of violence against people. It's structural violence. So so let me back up for a sec. What happens with conflict? Frankincense grows in these marginal areas. They're trees that are so resilient. They're able to grow in places that it just defies the imagination, how they can sucker themselves to rocks and literally grow straight out of the sides of cliffs, or they can also grow in sandy soils. But they're so resilient that they grow in marginal lands. Now, these marginal lands don't have a lot of water, don't have a lot of vegetation. And so you put humans in those zones. Those are folks who are living with water insecurity, which is one of the biggest problems, right? That lack of water creates a lot of poverty. And they're food insecure because it's hard to grow crops in these areas because they're water insecure and because they have poor soils. So the trees happen to grow in the ecosystems and in the climatic areas that are unstable for humans, but not quite totally uninhabitable, right? So there are those transition zones between more lush zones moving towards desert. So they're right in that transition. And so everywhere in the world that frankincense grows, there is human suffering and conflict. Now, one day when I just realized that, I sort of leaned back and wondered about the spiritual aspect of that the sacred tree, that this tree that there's so much attached to in terms of human spirituality being burned in churches and places of worship across the world for thousands of years, right? That the sacred tree, that everywhere it grows, almost everywhere it grows, there's human suffering and conflict. And so that's the setting we find ourselves in, right? In developing countries, in transitional marginal lands, and places where it's already set up for there to be human suffering. And in that context, the high demand in places without a high ability to control the trade, you get a setup for conflict resin, right? So that was a real surprise to me as well. Looking back, I worked in Sierra Leone for many years after the conflict, doing post-conflict environmental restoration and reconciliation. And we saw the effects firsthand of what conflict diamonds had done, and how that resource became a curse, a resource curse for Sierra Leone instead of a honeypot, right? So when we realized that we were actually in certain places, not everywhere it grows, but in certain places, we were seeing actual conflict over access to the resins because of the dwindling and small amount of resources. Add climate change on top of that. Like, add climate change on top, which shifts rains and reduces water or brings too much at once. You have this cauldron of difficult and complex circumstances for people living in poverty to deal with high demand from outside for that resource. So you absolutely can get physical conflict between people, and or just the trees being unfortunately growing in conflict zones. So for example, let me give an example. The border of Eritrea and Ethiopia. There's been active fighting. It's stopped now, but there's been fighting along that border between those two countries for many decades. Frankincense grows there. Papyrifera grows in those zones. And we found trees that had bullets in them, right? Because there was human conflict, not because of the trees, but trees were just stuck in the middle. So you get both. You get conflict directly for access to the trees in certain places. And then in other places, or sometimes overlaid, you have human conflict going on and the trees are in the middle.
I have a follow-up question to that. Do you believe that sustainability initiatives can be an antidote to this kind of conflict? Do you think it can foster peace and prosperity in these conflicted regions?
Yeah. Humanity is at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads with our planet and with ourselves and with each other. We sort of don't have a choice to go in that direction unless, well, we have lots of choices, but if we want to move through this crossroads towards a more sustainable future, and when I say sustainability, I mean earth care, people care, and fair share, right? That's sustainability. That's how you get environmental sustainability. It means it's also economically fair, and that we're also taking care of the planet, right? Not just for ourselves, but for the animals as well, and for wildlife to exist. We're at a crossroads where do we want to continue down this hyper-industrialized, globalized type of economic systems that, take from nature? Do we want to keep going forward with the idea that it's either jobs or the environment, when in fact it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? It's a mindset, and where do we want to put our resources going forward in the future? I have a lot of faith in the younger generations, especially as a professor, that there's an outcry from people. We see it all around the world for social justice, for environmental justice, and then we get pushback, right? There's a crossroads happening. We're at an evolutionary crossroads in terms of what we're going to do about the serious environmental issues and social issues facing us. And so it is absolutely possible. And I think it's the only way through. It's the only way to get to a future that's beneficial to everyone. So sustainability initiatives foster peace because they bring together earth care, people care, and fair share. So you can't just focus on the trees, right? It's not just about sustainability of environment. Sometimes environmentalists can miss the bigger picture, and they just isolate an ecosystem. Well, you have to work with the people involved with that ecosystem and the economics that are going on that create that situation. And so when you look at sustainability in a whole systems approach, when you look at the whole system, you can really identify sweet spots that will foster peace amongst people. And often, I'll give an example from Sierra Leone. It was an extremely brutal internal civil war that affected over 50,000 people, and also using child soldiers, right? Some of the harshest reality of fighting we've seen on the planet. And subsequently, you have an NGO that I worked with doing reconciliation work, doing traditional Sierra Leonean reconciliation work that for Westerners is very hard to understand because we want to punish somebody. But where they go through these processes of doing reconciliation in the communities, and one of the outcomes after a person goes through a process to confront someone who hurt them, that person then gardens for them. That person plants trees and does some of the labor around creating more abundance in food and gardens and farming and forestry for the person they hurt. That was part of the reconciliation work. And something about getting your hands in the soil and doing regenerative things like planting trees and growing food in sustainable fashion, it heals people. It's part of the healing process, right? And now that's an example of an extreme case, but even just for myself, right? Having a bad day, go outside in the garden, get your hands in the soil, right? My mood completely changes, and I'm grounded and I'm peaceful. It helps me be such a better person. So yeah, we can be sustainable. We must be sustainable. And now is the time. There's no waiting anymore. There's no, saying, oh, we have plenty of time for that. This is the time for people who are thinking this way to grow their voices, to come together and to put their minds together to solve problems that have existed for quite some time, but to look at it from a different perspective. And that's why I love working with young people so much. College students, they have a different perspective on things. They see things differently. So, yeah.
Well, that was incredible. But speaking of soil and, and gardening and farming, and the ecology nerd of the group, and I would love to know what sustainable agriculture looks like when it comes to frankincense. Like what is sustainable farming or harvesting?
Yeah. So I do work on many different aromatic species and different types of plants. And there's a real distinction between ones that are grown in cultivation and ones that are wildcrafted, right? So we just want to make sure that we're clear for the viewers that there's a distinction there. And frankincense, one of the hopes, right? We've already discussed that it grows in forests and that it's wildcrafted. one of the projects that is really near and dear to my heart is working on propagation of these trees and how we can replant more of them, not only back out into forest, into the wild, but also to bring them into cultivation. For many different reasons, this would really help people. Now, I don't advocate for taking frankincense trees out of their natural growing regions, right? I mean, for small demonstrations or for protection of rare species, that's fine. But I'm not advocating to start huge farms in Mexico, right? Because they probably grow, they probably would. As long as there's no frost, they can grow in lots of places with poor soils and limited water. There's a lot of the Earth's surface we've turned into that. So I really advocate for cultivation in Somaliland, in Oman, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Burkina Faso, to not take the resource away, to take it out. So I just want to be clear about that as well. So in terms of cultivation, we are been running a small nursery. We have a couple different nurseries that Save Frankincense is involved in, and myself particularly. And we've done it. We've proven that we can grow Carteri trees quite easily, actually, quite easily, because the tree is so resilient that we're able to propagate it with pretty good success rates. And so the hope is to really expand that, to be able to plant them in cultivation so that, one, it's hard work to tap these trees. Let me tell you, what the guys go through to get frankincense is really literally risking their lives. In most places, it's extremely hot, extremely hot. You have venomous snakes, which are real. I'm always really concerned about that when I'm in the field. And sometimes they're growing on cliffs or in places that are hard and inaccessible, but they still go at that because, these guys are tough. But we usually every season know of people who fall and die or get hurt tapping the trees. And so bringing them into cultivation would reduce the pressure on the wild forest while also providing more safety and a safe work environment for people who are tapping the trees. And so that's one of my hopes, is that in the next few years, we're planting hundreds of thousands of frankincense trees in cultivation and for reforestation. I'm definitely for, depending on the area, some areas have reforestation naturally, some don't, some countries don't. And so in that regard, so bringing the trees into cultivation, so you asked me, what does sustainable agriculture look like? Well, we don't want to bring frankincense trees into cultivation and just have a big monoculture of frankincense, right? Because what is not sustainable agriculture is monoculture, mass scale, globalized, outsource, pollution generating, right? These are all things that are not sustainable ag, because you need pesticides and herbicides. It's boring to the human psyche and to the human spirit. Monoculture is boring. It's like depression producing, because it's just a monocultured situation without diversity, right? The other aspect of what is not sustainable agriculture is enormous loss of topsoil from the industrialized agricultural approach. So if you visualize in your mind for a second, a mass scale agricultural production system with big machines, with a monoculture, with globalized, with growing one crop, let's just say corn, and then sending it out to other places, and that same place has to import food because that corn isn't even grown for that place, right? That's what's not sustainable ag. We do not want to do anything close to that with frankincense.